Hi, Judy.
Hi, Jackie.
Well, welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Well, thank you for my inaugural appearance.
This is really exciting, and I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. You've just published a fascinating article in Policy Review on women who become suicide bombers.
Yes, a cheery subject.
Yes, and to do that, you were given access to an Israeli prison housing women who, for various reasons, either for technical failure or because they got cold feet, failed in their attempts to martyr themselves and are now in detention. And so there's a lot to talk about. Maybe we can start with you just explaining how you came to be interested in this subject.
I got interested, Jackie, many years ago. I guess I was present at the creation of suicide bombing in a sense, in that I was the New York Times then newly appointed Cairo bureau chief in Egypt in 1983. Sometimes it feels like 1883. And I got word that there had been a terrible bombing at the Marine compound in Lebanon, in Beirut. And though the airport was closed, I kind of flew into Israel and drove across Israel to get there. And I got to this enormous, incredible site where so many Marines had been killed by the first suicide bomber. And one of the Marines who had survived the attack told me that the thing he remembered and that kept him awake at night was that the person who drove the truck into the Marine compound that killed over 400 Marines had been smiling, and he could not get this smile out of his face, and he couldn't forget that smile. And it's one of those things you hear that you just say, what's going on here? And then as I continued my stay in the Middle East, I continued my work in the Middle East, suicide bombing became, alas, an all too common phenomenon, and I gradually got very interested in the phenomenon, but it was very hard to write about it because most of the people who tried it succeeded in those days, and there was nobody to interview except survivors of these ghastly attacks who were never the suicide bombers. And so years and years went by, and gradually I found out that the Israelis had this repository of women and men, failed bombers. And knowing Arab culture and Arab society, and also Israeli security rules, I knew I was not going to be permitted to interview the men, and even if I did, it would be hard to get them to talk to me. So I decided to concentrate on women and to try and get into the prison to interview women who had tried and failed to commit suicide. And it took me a long time to set this up and a long time to talk my way into the prison. The Israelis had not let too many journalists interview these people, and all of these people who had been interviewed were Israelis. So this was kind of a first for them, and I wasn't sure they would even talk to me. But the fact that I had been in jail and I could tell them I'd been in jail made an impression on some of them. And two of them, I asked to see 3 of them, and 2 out of the 3 agreed to talk to me. The one whom I wanted to see, whose case I had studied, had been transferred to another prison just before I got there, so I couldn't see her.
So there are these 2 women that you profile in your piece, and
right.
they are the 2 very different faces of suicide bombers. There's the one unrepentant martyr, a would-be martyr who might do it again if she had the chance.
Well, she says she would. I'm not sure she would.
Yeah, she says she wouldn't, but she ominously says that she had a 1-year-old daughter at the time that this happened, and she ominously says that she wouldn't, if her daughter wanted to follow in her footsteps, she wouldn't necessarily discourage her, which I thought was very sad to read.
It's part of the problem. It's part of the syndrome. Suicide bombing does not happen in a vacuum. It happens when a society actively supports it. And absent that support, it doesn't happen.
Well, one of the terms of art that comes out in your piece is the martyrdom machine. It's more than a network. It's really the entire support structure for martyrdom operations, which, as you say, don't exist in a vacuum.
Yes. This is a term that I borrowed and credited from another journalist, Anne-Marie Oliver, I think, or Olivier, who writes about this in a very moving and powerful way. I was not able to go to Gaza on this trip because, we'd gotten word that the militants were looking for a foreign journalist to capture and to kidnap. And so I chose not to go to Gaza on this trip. And alas, Alan Johnson of the BBC was kidnapped shortly after I left. But Anne-Marie and other journalists have written about Palestinian society and the dynamics of it that support this. And I don't think we can emphasize enough how important it is to have the support of a community.
I think I would be the second of the two suicide bombers, which experts note, doesn't represent the majority of would-be martyrs or suicide bombers, is such a sad story. I gave your article to some of my friends in Princeton here who are not policy wonks and foreign policy experts. And they were all so moved by this woman's story, which in a way could be any woman's story. If you are living in a society with limited options, which has damaged you through a series of events, and just such a tragic story. Maybe you want to say something about Al-Bis.
About Waf El-Bis, yes.
Waf El-Bis.
I should tell you a little bit about how I found her. I had actually seen pictures of her. I had seen a video in which she actually tried to blow herself up. That was captured on video by the Israelis at the Erez crossing point between Gaza and Israel. This woman wearing a loose cloak to try and disguise the bomb that she had around her leg. That's unusual. It wasn't a vest. It was like a suicide leggings almost. Standing there, screaming, crying, clawing at her face, tugging at the detonator, pulling again and again to try to make it function. The detonator did not function, which is why she didn't succeed. And I saw that video, and it was impossible not to be moved by, her obvious despair, both at that moment, and it was one reason I wanted so much to interview her. I then saw her at a press conference that the Israelis had shortly after that event, in which she told them of her desire to kill Israelis, as many as possible, 20, 40, 60, it didn't matter, she said, even children. She said, yes, you kill our children, why shouldn't I kill yours? I did it for Palestine, I'd do it again. She was kind of this portrait of just like the first woman I interviewed, someone who had no remorse at this press conference. The woman I saw in jail was totally, totally different. Wafa El-Bis, she's now 23 years old. She tried to carry out her attack in 2005, so she was 21 when she went to jail. Wafa El-Bis was this demure, shy, soft-spoken, very pretty Palestinian woman, except for the fifth digit of her hands, which were, the fingertips were deformed. and you could see on her head, on her neck, even though she wore a headscarf. Both women wore headscarves, and the women I saw in prison all wore headscarves except for one of two of them. She had burn marks, and this had been the result of a terrible accident that she'd had in her home cooking, in her kitchen of her home. On her birthday, she had been trying to cook a cake, and the oven had exploded, and she had been covered in burns. And she had actually, her life had been saved, and she'd been treated for those burns and healed. The facial scars were no longer visible at an Israeli hospital. And she and her parents had written this unbelievably moving letter of thanks for the care that she had gotten while she was burned in this ward. What she didn't tell me, and I learned after I had left the prison, was that in addition to writing the letter, she hadn't wanted to leave the hospital. She said that she cried, she screamed, she held onto the bed. She had to be forcefully taken out of the hospital to sent back to Gaza because this young woman's situation was just so appalling. She was, one of...
She was in an abusive family.
Abusive family. She didn't go into it because it's a shame, but it was very clear that she had been beaten as a child. Her father was ignorant. She loved school, but she hadn't done well. It was clear that she just had no life. She didn't tell me this, but once again, friends and the dossiers that I saw on her told me that her fiancé, to whom this was her last hope, had ditched her after the accident. She really had no reason to live and to want to live. And she told me herself that this was why she had done this. She said she wasn't political, she wasn't religious, she didn't believe in God, she didn't believe that she was going to go to paradise for her act, she didn't believe that any of the, quote, martyrs were going to go to paradise, but that her life just wasn't worth living. And I said, well, what about your press conference and those statements you made? And she said, well, she had felt that she had to say that because it was what was expected. It was clear that she hoped that the people who had sent her, and we can talk about that, but she'd kind of been intimidated into volunteering for this mission. When she had second thoughts, she tried to pull out, but they told her they'd actually come to her house and blow her up and blow up her family.
Well, what's clear is that in her case especially, it seems, the martyrdom machine worked overtime to target and co-opt and cajole her. And even members of her family, her own mother, strapped her into some of the garments that she wore on that day.
I think that's the last thing I learned as I was leaving Israel. And once again, I have to stress, because, I don't know that what these women are telling me is the truth. I don't know that what the Israeli security people are telling me is the truth. I don't know. It's so hard to figure out where the truth lies, but on this we're pretty sure, because actually there was corroborating evidence that I saw for it. She told me that her parents hadn't known what she was planning to do and that she had kept this secret deep inside her and had just done it as an act of despair. And yet, it turns out that the martyrdom video that she made was recorded in her own house in Gaza, and that when the suicide pants zipper broke that she was supposed to wear, her mother had repaired the zipper for her. So her parents, according to Israeli security, were not only knew about this, they were witting accomplices. And I just found that on a human level so heartbreaking that it's hard to know where to begin to repair the wounds in a society like this. No matter how much one hates the enemy, and I've been going to the Middle East, and it was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict which initially got me interested in the Middle East back in the early 70s when I was a student. No matter how much one hates one's enemy, to believe that you would help your son or daughter commit suicide to kill the enemy, or as Mia Bloom, a scholar, writes, dying to kill. It's just hard for me to kind of wrap my mind around that, as much as I've seen in all these years and over 30 years of covering the region. It's kind of incomprehensible and so sad. And I just kept looking at this young girl who, had her circumstances and her life been different, would have probably, been a young mother and somebody whose life lay ahead of her, and instead she had absolutely nothing to look forward to, and even talking to me was risky, because when she gets out of jail, unless she spouts the party line, her family won't be protected and they won't be paid, and her life won't be worth living. So it's so tragic.
Yeah. Before we turn to kind of the larger policy implications of your piece and what you learned, one thing that was really interesting to me to read about was life in this Israeli jail for these women. Now, we don't know whether this is typical of all jails, and this is obviously a high security facility.
Yes.
Obviously, these women are special among the prisoners there. But a couple things struck me. One is that if you have outside support, you can purchase food and cook for yourself and
Yes.
have personal possessions in your cell. This woman did not appear. It appeared that no one was supporting her or helping or sending her food, for example, or money.
Well, it wasn't clear. She seemed, she's very slight, and but she didn't appear hungry. She first said that the Israelis wouldn't let her talk to her mother, but then she talked about a visit with her family, and she talked about letters that went back and forth between her family. The stories are very confused. Having known something about American prisons from the inside, I can tell you that yes, it's always hard to know what goes on when there are no outsiders around, but the facility was not unlike American jails that I have seen and experienced, and the conditions that I saw in terms of the cells, and they have access to television, all the books they can read, their own food, as you pointed out. Many of them told me that their parents were being taken care of by the prisoners' clubs that support the families and the women while they're in jail. The other woman, whom we haven't discussed yet, for example, she gets the equivalent of about $350 a month, which is a very healthy stipend on the West Bank, where the per capita income is about $1,000
It did seem
a month.
that the other woman, whom we haven't talked about as much, did sort of seem to have more outside support. But and the other remarkable thing, of course, is that you get to keep your children with you for 2 years.
Yes, for 2 years. Now, I was not expecting that. When I walked into one of the wards, these women are kept in 2 security wards, and they're also permitted to be housed according to their group, so that if you're a member of Hamas, you can be with other Hamas women, and if you're a member of Fatah, you're with other Fatah women, and they have block leaders. When I asked about this, the Israelis told me, well, it's easier to respond to their needs this way, to have one woman spokesman speak for them. But I wasn't expecting to see this baby who was being nursed by her mother and kind of looked after and fussed over by the other women, because Israel permits women to retain their children until they are 2 years old. So you have this very bizarre, almost kindergarten-like atmosphere with, one baby and many, many mothers in the room. I hadn't expected that, and I also hadn't expected to see these women quite as outspoken as they were. None of them refused to talk to me until the leader of one of the wards said, "You're an American?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "We don't talk to Americans because Americans are allied with Israel, our enemy, and America is the enemy of all Muslims, and, then the party line was set, and it was much harder to get the others to cooperate. These cell block women who are appointed or anointed within the prison system actually tell these women, they coach a lot of the women as to what they're supposed to say and what they're not supposed to say, which is another factor that makes it very difficult to sort out how a woman really feels versus what she feels she has to say in order to get along inside the prison and get prison respect and street creds. It's very hard to sort out.
Well, and in fact, the second case, that the woman that you profile, she is due to be released.
Yes,
and
in October.
In October, and so it's which is, I don't know if you learned what's the typical sentence for these women?
Well, it depends on the circumstances in which they're caught and when they're caught. For example, this other woman that I interviewed, Shifa El-Qudsi, she's 31 years old, and she's been in prison for 5 years. Her younger brother, who was also a failed suicide bomber, got an 18-year sentence. I asked her why her sentence was so relatively light, and she said, well, because they hadn't caught me with a suicide vest on me. She had been apprehended at her house, and the vest was nowhere to be seen, so she got a relatively lighter sentence. I think Israelis tend to give women lighter sentences, as do others in some cultures. But it really depends on the circumstances. I mean, there are some suicide bombers who get life sentences. Israel has no death penalty except for, we all know of or some of us remember the Eichmann case. But apart from that, there's no death penalty. So some of them have life sentences. Some of them have 3 and 4 life sentences. But in her case, she was just convicted of aiding and abetting, even though she herself was a suicide bomber. So, but she was much tougher. She'd been in jail longer. She had a support system. She had a very clear political line. She said she was certain that what she had done was the right thing. We talked about her daughter. She said that even though she taught her daughter that education was the most important thing in life, if her daughter wanted to follow in her footsteps, she would not discourage her. It was a very depressing experience to do.
Right.
Spend time around these women.
I know we don't have huge amounts of time left, so maybe we could just talk a little bit about. One interesting thing is, you published this piece in Policy Review, a journal affiliated with Stanford's Hoover Institution, although I think it's based in D.C., the journal itself.
Right.
It read to me very much like a kind of, piece I'd expect to read in Vanity Fair or The New Yorker. So, although there is definitely, the scholarly, policy relevant analysis that I hope we talk about. But how did you happen to
write it there?
Right, and Hoover is, somewhat. Hoover is understood to be known to be a conservative think tank, and I think the journal maybe seeks to be more nonpartisan. But I don't know. Tell us about.
Well, I think the journal is reaching out to people who are not kind of mainstream conservatives to get them to write, and it's producing a more lively and interesting journal. I had been reading the journal lately, and I was intrigued with a lot of the pieces that I read there. And I had also initially thought, just as you did, Jackie, that this was a great story for Vanity Fair or for a kind of a more general interest news publication, and but the reaction was interesting. It was like, well, we know about suicide bombers, or we've done women suicide bombers. And I wasn't certain when I approached people about their interest in the subject whether or not I'd even get inside the prison, because the Israelis hadn't said yes yet. But I said, I think that I might have a kind of different approach, which is talking to these women themselves. But in our modern culture, well, we had our suicide women's piece and we don't want another one. It hasn't happened here, so people don't feel that the subject is relevant to them. And what Policy Review wanted, and it was their idea, because I just wanted to write these two women's stories, and they said, no, take a look at the scholarly literature and combine the two. It was actually at their encouragement that I did that, and I'm so glad that Todd Lindbergh suggested it. He's the editor. And so I then had to read about 15 books on suicide bombing to see what the scholars said about it, and there's some amazingly good literature out there. And so I wound up combining these two women's stories with where they fit in the spectrum of what we now think we know about this phenomenon. And it was a great experience for me, and I really loved writing for them and hope to continue doing it. As for me, now that I'm freelance and I'm permitted to have my own views, even though it's hard for me after all those years of New York Times training that says I'm, objective and independent, I decided I'll write for anybody who gives me an interesting topic and pays the freight, and I'll go out there and do it. And I'm kind of think of myself as relatively non-ideological, so I was delighted to make an appearance in a magazine that reached out also to me and as somebody who was not a scholar, but was a journalist and was trying to reach an audience that maybe normally I wouldn't have been able to reach. Because I think the implications of what I saw and what I learned are interesting, and I hope we'll be able to talk about it a little.
Right. Well, I don't want to oversimplify what the scholarly literature says, but if I had to sort of break it down, my reading of it is, there are, two big schools of thought in sort of how you go about combating suicide bombings. One is articulated perhaps by Dr. Pape of University of Chicago?
Yes,
who,
for the moment.
Whose position it can be summarized as suicide bombings stop when there is withdrawal, either U.S. forces from Iraq or withdrawal of Israeli presence from the occupied territories.
Right.
And that's the single biggest thing you can do to kind of grind it all to a halt instantaneously. Right. The second school of thought articulated by, I think there was I can't remember, you'll know the name, but there's an Israeli scholar who wrote a big paper about it. Basically says that Israel has been very effective in reducing suicide bombings with better intelligence.
Yes.
And with tell us how you'd summarize. I think that
well, look, these are the facts. One, we are dealing with a phenomenon and a tactic of terrorism which is contagious. It's growing. Look at Iraq. In the year that I was there, embedded with the U.S. military, 2003, there were 30. Now there are, there are 80% of the 555 suicide bombings that took place last year occurred in Iraq. This is a phenomenon which is spreading. There are 38 countries where we've seen suicide bombing now. The causes, Bob Pape's thesis is that all we have to do to end it is to remove the cause of the bombing, which in the case of Al-Qaeda is our presence in the Middle East. In the case of the Palestinians is the Israeli presence in the West Bank. And you're right, the other scholars, Israeli scholars, say, no. It's true that the violence, the suicide bombing violence, has declined since Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, but other forms of violence have continued. And just because you withdraw does not mean that the violence will stop, though it may take a different form. Pape seems to have the statistics on his side, but most of the scholars, virtually all of the other scholars, disagree and say you are dealing with a phenomenon which will continue because it is as much a function of the psychodynamics of a society as it is a cause. And let me just tell you what I think they mean by that. if Israel withdraws from the West Bank, as now many people are saying it should and it must, and therefore the violence will disappear, what's really happening, the reason the numbers went down in Israel that we know of, is that the apprehension rates have gone up. Half of those who attempt to commit suicide, more than half, are apprehended by Israeli security. And they say they're able to do that because they're in the West Bank, infiltrating these movements, knowing the people who are providing the logistical support, and they're stopping them. Both of these women, there was advance warning of both of the women, the attempts that I covered. So, the problem with defining leaving is that for the Palestinian Hamas, they define Palestinian territory as not just the West Bank and Gaza, but all of Israel. So it's hard to see where Israel can withdraw to and, quote, eliminate the alleged cause of the suicide bombing. The same with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda says we, the infidels, the Americans, are occupying sacred Arab soil. If we withdraw to the United States, supposedly the suicide bombing will stop, except that the suicide bombers have already come here in the form of the 9/11 bombers. And if you define, as Al-Qaeda does, all of the world as potentially Muslim and see it as your duty to maintain the spread of your religion, then there's no place to withdraw to. So I think instinctively, even though the numbers don't justify the argument, the other scholars make an argument that withdrawal is not the solution. Sorry, Jackie, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just going to suggest that, reading what I've read, and obviously, not as much as some of these Israeli scholars, that argument appears to me to be somewhat politically expedient and justifying a pragmatic reality, which is that the Israeli government may or may not be able to fully withdraw. There may always be an Israeli presence of some kind.
Oh yeah, I think there are reasons beyond suicide bombing, stopping it or not, that keep Israel in that area.
Right.
And I don't particularly want to talk about that today, but clearly there are other reasons for them to remain in the West Bank, or they would be gone. When Israel found it, when Ariel Sharon, who is no softy, who is no dove, decided that it was no longer in Israel's interest to stay in Gaza, he withdrew. The violence followed Israel back to its borders, even though the suicide bombing did not. So,
right. And
this is something that Hamas, and by the way, Al-Fatah also, which is a secular organization,
right.
All groups use this tactic. This is not just a religious phenomenon, and I think Pape is right in that we shouldn't overemphasize the, quote, religious roots of this phenomenon.
But the majority of the suicide bombers are
yes. Yes.
I mean, I don't know if there are statistics about this, but it would be interesting to know how many are secular.
It's very interesting because the Tamil Tigers, who are not really, first of all, they're not Muslim, but they've had 10,000 Tamil Tiger cadres, and 1/3 of them, for example, have been female suicide commandos. That's a huge portion. You have the PKK in Kurdistan, which is not a religious organization. Most of its adherents are Muslim, but it's not religiously based in the way that Al-Qaeda or these other militant groups are, and they have relied on suicide bombing. I think you can't divorce the religion in this instance from this phenomenon, since it seems to be, suicide bombing seems to be so prevalent in Islamic societies, but you shouldn't overemphasize the Islamic component either. And I must also stress, and this is really important to remember, is that the traditional interpretations of Islam make suicide haram. It's forbidden. And
right.
That's why the people who do this are very adamant about calling themselves martyrs for their faith, holy warriors, because suicide as a practice is forbidden.
Right. I guess the other thing, just going back to the issue about the Israeli scholars who argue that total withdrawal isn't the way to go, there's the wall. There's the wall that the Israelis point to as contributing to the decrease in successful martyrdom operations.
And not
of course,
just
the
that,
gigantic,
but all crime. I mean, they point to the wall and they say, you see, all crime is down, therefore the wall is working. Look, it's the intel, it's the intelligence. I think the much harder argument for Israel is that there is no doubt that the presence of Israelis in the West Bank running confidential informants, running undercover people, that has made a big difference. And whether or not the Israelis would still be able to get that kind of intelligence if they withdrew is a big question. And I think many people think that it's not likely that they'd be able to do so, which is an argument against withdrawal. But there are many other arguments that would lead you to believe that that the longer Israel stays, the greater the underlying causes of Palestinian anxiety and Palestinian despair. It's a very complicated argument. I think you have to try and divorce it somewhat from the suicide bombing phenomenon, but it's very hard to do because so many of these women spoke about the cousins, their brothers, friends whose houses had been demolished, who'd been killed. I mean, I remember Shafa El-Qudsi said to me, the best of our people become martyrs, so how can I not do so? And when you have that kind of political dynamic going, it's just extremely difficult to stop it.
Maybe in the couple of remaining minutes we have, maybe you do. What about the issue about suicide bombers in the United States, aside from 9/11? We have how I mean, do you feel it's inevitable? Do you think we've just been lucky?
Well, there was like good news and bad news about my reporting experience doing this. There's no good news in suicide bombing, I can tell you. But the better news is that I came away thinking that even though the potential reservoir of suicide bombers is much vaster than I thought it was. I mean, this is the bad news, is that you didn't have to be a religious fanatic or in utter despair. I mean, El-Qudsi told me that her life was great before she decided to do this. She was fine. By the way, it's not true, but her life was relatively okay compared to others around her. So the bad news is the people who can be recruited are much broader than anybody thinks. And but the good news is I wanted to call this piece, and Hillary Clinton supporters will never forgive me, it takes a village, because you really do need this kind of culture of death, and the logistics people, and the people who tape the video, martyrdom videos, and the people who make the vests, the people who carry the bomber to their target, the people who provide logistical support for that, who make the explosives, who make the cards that kids in kindergarten then exchange, the martyrdom cards, the people, the poets who write the poems in their honor. It takes this whole infrastructure, and it takes geographic and psychological and political space to organize suicide bombing on a massive, consistent, relentless scale. And I don't think we have that kind of a disenfranchised, unhappy, angry, embittered Muslim population in this country. Our country is amazingly blessed at being able to integrate people, so many different kinds of people who want to live here. And we simply don't have either the numbers or those kinds of seething, bitter resentments that would sustain a campaign of suicide bombing. Are we likely to have suicide bombers? I fear yes. But I think, Jackie, they're going to be kind of one-off events like, right. And I don't want to minimize it because I live in New York, about 10 blocks from the World Trade Center. You will have one-off events. Remember, Al-Qaeda had to send those people into our country. They didn't come from here. And even though the NYPD is now, the New York Police Department is very worried about what they call radicalization and self-radicalization of young Muslims on the internet and through radical mosques here. I don't think you see the kind of support of the community or support of their friends or networks that would enable them to sustain the kind of relentless day after day suicide bombing attempts that we see in Iraq, that we see in Israel. We haven't seen it since the wall went up. We haven't seen it since Israelis really concentrated on this problem. And we haven't seen it since Hamas decided it wasn't in its tactical interest to continue these attacks. But it could start again there. I just don't see it here as a sustained phenomenon. And I hope on that I'm right. I would just hate to be proven wrong, because this kind of violence is not only so lethal. You know, the average terrorist attack kills between 3 and 6 people. A suicide bombing attack kills on average 80 people. And if you use a vehicle, it kills on average 90 people. So this is an extremely pernicious deadly form of violence. But more than that, it's a psychologically destabilizing form of violence that really not only corrupts the society that condones it, but really destabilizes the society that it's aimed at. And I found something remarkable in Israeli society, which is one thing they decided that they were not going to do is they were not going to succumb to suicide bombing as a phenomenon. They were not going to give into it. And so after an attack, I have actually seen them clean up a site in an hour, and you're talking about even violent ones with blood and body parts all over the place, and within an hour, within 2 hours, they have traffic moving, people are back to work, business as usual, because they consider a form of deterrence to be the message they send out, which is, we will not be. We will mourn, we will grieve privately, but we will not as a society be paralyzed by this. I know that Americans can't do that. So, it's another reason I hope we don't have that phenomenon, because we're simply not able to do what the Israelis are doing and what the Brits did when they were fighting Irish violence, though, by the way, they never had the suicide bombing campaigns that we've seen in Islamic countries.
I think that the sad note on which to end is, if we're going to be lucky in the United States for all the reasons you very well articulated, it really looks down the road, in the case of Israel at least, maybe Iraq is different if U.S. forces eventually withdraw. In the case of Israel, it looks like there just may be this kind of unending violence. The speedy
people like
cleanups
me and I think you, I don't want to speak for you, but I have always said, and I think most Israelis would agree, even though their determination is being tested by the events today that are going on in Gaza, that ultimately you need a political solution. We can talk about fighting terrorism, we can talk about battling suicide bombing, and we have to do that, especially when we're dealing with nihilistic groups like Al-Qaeda and those for whom there can really be no negotiation. I know some scholars disagree with that, but I think I've covered these groups for long enough. But when you are dealing with a phenomenon like the Palestinian case, you are dealing with a set of political, social grievances that really require a political solution. And I would point out that between the Oslo Peace Accords, which the last time I looked in on militant Islam in my book, my earlier book on it, God Has 99 Names, that was written in 1996. Between 1993, when the Israelis and the Palestinians made a peace accord, and 2000, which was when the Intifada, the second Intifada broke out, there were no suicide bombings. There were almost none, and there was virtually no violence. So during that period when people had hope, the violence declined, and ultimately except for the Al-Qaedas of the world and the nihilists, I think we have to find political solutions to these problems. And I'm very hard-headed about what one must do until you find such a political solution. But I don't think we can kid ourselves that intelligence is ultimately the answer. You ultimately have to give the Wafa al-Basas and the Shif al-Qudsis reason to live. And exactly. That goes far beyond a political solution. That goes into a cultural solution which says women can have wonderful, fulfilling lives, whether or not they are wives and mothers. You have to do away with things like the shame culture that says that if a woman sleeps with a man before she's married, she's defiled and her life is not worth living. The roots of the problem are so deep and go so deep that even political solutions between Arabs and Israelis are not going to solve a lot of the terrible dynamics that I've seen now in Palestinian society. These problems are so deep that it's very difficult to know where one starts to address them. One does what one can to protect oneself during this period, which is what the Israelis are doing. I think, what they are doing has brought down the level of suicide bombing. But in the long run, people like Mia Bloom and others argue the longer these conditions prevail, the sociological, the political conditions, the greater the reservoir of people to choose from for the next generation and the next generation of suicide bombers. And remember, the next generation may not be wearing suicide vests. They may be carrying weapons of mass destruction, and then we're into a kind of phenomenon that you're into Hollywood horror scenarios, and so far we haven't seen that. But given the technology, Jackie, that you, more than any other analyst I know, is well aware of, I think we can imagine a future which is very, very dark, even darker than the one we're seeing. So the technology is going in the wrong direction. The politics are going in the wrong direction. It's hard for me to think of a society that's better off today, psychologically, economically, culturally, in the Middle East than when I started out 30 years ago, except possibly Israel. And even there, the psychological toll is huge of this unending struggle. But the indicators are not good. I think in the long run, we just have to be very, very worried about what we've seen, what we're seeing there, how we ourselves have contributed to the problem. It's a mess. I can't remember a time that's quite as bad as now.
It's a mess, and I think that the political will to find that the will to find a political solution that can at least provide the supporting structure for some of these other changes that you've described is non-existent now. I feel that we're in kind of this caretaker mode of the Middle East peace process. We're just trying to muddle through until hand it off to another administration, and in the meantime we are in this terrible status quo. That's
we are at
deeply
this point.
Dispiriting.
And given what's going on between Fatah and Hamas now in Gaza and the West Bank, you talk about a partner for peace, but who is it? Israel says it's now going to support the Fatah government, but let's remember why not only a majority of people in Palestinians in Gaza, but a majority of people in the West Bank rejected Fatah. It's corruption, it's unwillingness to find a political solution, its rejection of the peace process that was going on under Clinton, when I think we came closest to finding a political compromise that ultimately Yasser Arafat rejected and couldn't live with. We have failure in the Palestinian society now it's very obvious at all levels. And what does Israel do at this point? It's easy to blame Israel for the situation, but at this point it's hard to know. It's such a mess. So many mistakes have been made by both sides over such a long time. It's really hard to know what to do, and I wouldn't know what to tell. If I were advising the Israelis, I really wouldn't know what to tell them to do. Who do you talk to at this point? You wrap your arms around Abbas and hope that he can prevent Hamas from taking control of the West Bank? Do you have a political consolidation? I don't know.
Well, the forces that gave rise to Hamas's victories, where it's so ably exploited the despair and the dysfunction in those societies in Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, that certainly is an important starting place that lots of people recognize.
Yes.
But unfortunately, it's just been impossible to kind of remedy or even begin the process of building up those societies. It's really it's a classic chicken and the egg problem. There's a political problem, and then there are the social and cultural issues, and they're deeply intertwined.
Exactly.
And
exactly. I remember when I went out as a student in 1971 to Israel, Jordan, and Egypt and Lebanon. And with my American mindset, I said, well, this isn't so hard to solve. You just do a little territorial exchange here, and both peoples will be able to live in separate states that will fulfill their national aspirations. And it was such an American way of looking at a part of the world that I knew nothing about, and in which American-style logic simply doesn't hold. And I guess as a result of that, I have many more questions about everything than I used to, but one thing I'm certain, what we're dealing with now in terms of militant Islam is a very different phenomenon. Wherever its roots, and I think its roots, Jackie, go back way beyond this Arab-Israeli crisis. You have had a struggle between militant and mainstream Islam almost from the beginning of the religion. How that plays out on the broader political spectrum will affect what happens inside Israel and the Arab territories, and Israel and Palestine, Israel and Egypt, and I'm, at this point, not certain which way that pendulum is swinging, whether or not the militants are gaining ground, as they appear to be now, or whether or not mainstream Muslims who believe in a kind of tolerant, let everyone live his own life, religion, which is what I encountered when I first went to the Middle East. That was the Islam I encountered, right. And that I think the overwhelming majority of Muslims still believe. Whether or not those people will find the courage and the backbone to fight the militants and defeat them, I don't know. I really don't know.
Well, on that note. Well, thanks. Thanks for this discussion. I think it's a really fascinating topic, and I really enjoyed reading your article. And,
thank you.
We'll put up a link to it on the website so
Thank
that
you very much.
Other people can have a look too.
Well, I'm
right.
glad, and I have enjoyed watching blogging heads here, and I'm sorry about the fluorescent light, but my office is a bit of a mess at the moment here in New York as we're constantly building, and so I couldn't talk to you any other way.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jackie.